presentation. He will help. Okay. So when you look at the SDLC, we started working on this. I suppose, Dave, you and I brought this up on the agenda of the ARB probably more than a year ago. And we started working fairly intensely with developer groups and others around the state to review the content, what should be there, what would be reasonable that somebody would actually use. I think the first thing we looked at was like 30 or 40 pages long, and to be truthful with you, I never got all the way through it. I got sidetracked. And knowing how I got sidetracked, I determined, well, that isn't a very good idea. Nobody will get it. It's too much. So the challenge that I was given and that I came up with in part by myself was, can we express an SDLC as software development lifecycle in 2 pages or less? And that's what we've done. So the entire SDLC document with the usual policy boilerplate that surrounds it is about 2 pages long. Now, there's a reason for that. It's written on a process level. The last thing I want to do is have arguments here with you on RAD, Agile, Waterfall, Cowboy, whatever you want. I don't want to talk about those kinds of things because frankly, that's the way you choose to work. You pick your own methodology. So we're not trying to be prescriptive in that regard. You have things that are already working really well for you. What we're trying to do with the SDLC is say, okay, we've got these little external customers, small players like the Internal Revenue Service and other federal partners, and they've all come back to us in audit reviews and have said, we want a documented SDLC. So the decision we made working with developers around the state is, let's do it on a process level, and so that's what we're trying to do here. So when you get into an SDLC and think about what it is, let's take a simple approach. It's basically a framework that describes the expected activities performed as you develop software. You don't need to make it much more complicated than that. There are probably at least 100 different software development life cycles out there that are fairly significant. Our approach again is to take a simple approach. So, SDLC methodology, we'll start with Dilbert. I think the message of this is fairly clear. Before you accept the software contract, this reminded me of some of our federal partners. You wrote under contract, tell me what development methodology you used, and then it goes on and gets worse and worse. The message that we discovered as we were putting this together is we needed to have a fairly clear explanation of the overall process. Nobody really cared that much about the methodology, which was something that made us all really happy, because we didn't want to get into religious methodology wars, because they'll go on and on. Common development methodologies that you're familiar with, there's Capgemini's, SDM, SDM2, you've got Waterfall, Iterative, Agile, my tried and true favorite, the Cowboy method, where you don't cooperate with anybody or talk to anybody, you just do it. And from our perspective, as we listened to developers around the state, the message was pretty clear. Effective and timely really trumps methods. So if you've got a method that's working well for you, great, not a problem. Stick with it. And then the other thing, the famous Yogi Berra statement, if you don't know where you're going, you might wind up someplace else. And as you look at software projects, I suspect there's not a person in this room that hasn't seen one that started with one intent and finished with a totally different intent, or didn't finish at all. And there's quite a range. So when you look at this, again, taking a simple approach, we're really not trying to do a lot of things here that are hard or terribly complicated. As we work with our external funding partners and as we look at best practices, this is fairly straightforward. Establish a standard expectation for implementation of a life cycle that produces software that's secure, accessible, mobile ready, and compliant with state development standards, policies, and practices. So again, we set standards, we look at things that we want to do, we want to color within the lines, we want to make sure that the SDLC causes us to think about each of those areas. Who's impacted by it? All GTS employees, contractors, temporary workers, anybody involved in the development of software. So this affects everyone, which is why it's written on a level that it's not unduly prescriptive. So you get into the characteristics of this SDLC as we go through it. It defines a common process expectation. What are the steps? What are the things you really need to consider? When I use that accessibility word, what does that really mean in terms of software implementation? What about mobile? All kinds of issues come up. Again, not prescriptive for development methodology. We focus on planning, development, and release process. And in some ways, calling it a software development life cycle, it's maybe closer to a release life cycle. We could argue that forever, but that's kind of where it is. We're trying to identify areas of specific concerns that are biting us all the time. Accessibility, mobility, and security. I don't think I need to explain any one of those. It's been interesting. A few years ago, we were looking at Utah.gov use on the website of things, and we noted that it's kind of interesting. We had, I think at that time, what was it, Dave? 7% mobile use was very low, and Dave and I drew a little line and said, well, it's going to go up. Well, it's at 21% now and growing. So you just can't avoid making the application mobile ready. If you do, you're cutting off about a fifth of your audience. So it's a really important issue. The other thing that comes out of this again is we want to make sure the process that we go through is one that's consistent enough that when an auditor like the IRS or someone else comes in, they can say, oh, I get it. And these are the kinds of artifacts I should be able to expect along the way. The other thing we're trying to look at when we do this is that not all projects are created equal. Some of them are big, hairy, hard mothers. Some of you worked on projects that have lasted years. Those are totally different problems than a project that's designed to be done in 2 weeks, which is why we look at the process, not telling you how to do it, because it just doesn't make any sense. And then the other thing we try to do is go out and review all the best development practices. What are people who are really successful with life cycles doing? So, this one has 7 phases. They seem to be the ones that made sense, and they seem to be the areas where people get in a lot of trouble. How many of you have ever done a coding project where you just kind of were told over the fence, so to speak, what they wanted, and you just started coding? Is there anybody here that hasn't done that? I've done it. And it doesn't usually work really well. You get all kinds of changes, change requests. And, oh, you didn't understand what I wanted? Oh, okay, I get it. So we think there's some stages that are really important. Have you ever started a software project, you found out halfway through there wasn't a budget for it? Anybody ever done that? It works in state government all the time, it happens. So we're kind of saying, you know, there are some loops, some things we need to go through to make this work. So this preliminary analysis phase, we think should be driven by the business. These are the people that own the requirements, they're the ones that know what they want, not necessarily owned by IT. We need to engage, no argument. We need to help with cost estimates. One of the more interesting things that we get from time to time is a legislator will come to the legislative fiscal analyst or the planning and say, we want to do this system. What's it going to cost? I hate those questions. But at that point, IT then engages with the business owner and owners, and we begin to try to figure out a ballpark. But again, the big deal is, what do you really want to do? And so when you look at the analysis, the business and GTS get together and figure out how to do it. We look at databases, we look at everything. I don't think I need to describe development to you. Systems design, you guys understand. Integration and testing. We've had a nasty habit occasionally forgetting to do accessibility testing, not thinking through mobile to make sure this will work in a mobile platform. Sometimes we do things nobody in this room would, but how do you mind? Browser-dependent development. We're only working on browser. It doesn't really work very well when you're going multi-platform. And we're living in a multi-platform world. It needs to be able to run just about anything you can think of the user coming up with. That causes us to behave a little differently. And then maintenance, change control, the things that we have to address by GTS policy to make sure things run well. And when we make changes, Russ has a way of getting a little intense if we don't go through the process. True? So we're trying to address that as well. Please.
Bob, in documentation, you was thinking that's under the system design. Have you thought about documentation in this process?
Oh yeah, yeah we have, and I'll go into it in more detail as we move through it. All of these, there are various artifacts and things that have to be written down along the way. So remember, one of the purposes of a defined SDLC is to work with external funding partners. And you know what they like? Documentation. So you've got to have it. I prefer to look at documentation on a common sense level. You can get paralyzed by it. We're really not after that. And frankly, neither any of our external partners. They want to be able to see in a common sense way what it is we're doing and why.
So under your maintenance, would you also consider monitoring as being part of maintenance? Or would
Could
that
be.
happen previous to that?
Could be. One of the things we do with a lot of the projects that we work on is we define the maintenance phase perhaps a little differently than some do. I tend to look at it as a chance for the customer to come back to me and say, oh, this was a nice project, but here's some things I really need. And so that, in some cases, is nothing more than maintenance. In some cases, it's a major development project. It just kind of depends on what we're looking at. But, yeah. So when we look at this preliminary analysis phase is the one that I see an amazing amount of failure on. Because it's the part where either somebody doesn't have a vision or somebody isn't thinking through the alternatives. And the cartoon is funny, but it's painfully real. We want to satisfy the customer we're working with because they, after all, brought us the idea. You know, they usually have the funding too. But sometimes we don't take enough time to really listen to them and understand what they want to do. It's a very big issue. So we have a lot of concerns on that to make sure that we capture what the customer wants. And again, we have to address the financial side here. Sometimes what customers want, customers can't afford, which is why the budget side has to weigh in very early on. Because I don't know about you, but I used to have a Dilbert cartoon in my drawer. In fact, I think I still got it. A pointy-haired boss looks at Dilbert and said, what can you do with half the budget? And he said, fail. And then the boss says, when can you start? I think I already did. Statement. We laugh at that, but you know, we've all been there, where we've started something and we knew we didn't have the resources to see it to completion. We would like to tie that down in step one, make sure we have the resources to do it. Yeah, we're not going to be right all the time, but at least let's be realistic with ourselves. So this preliminary analysis phase, several different steps. Conduct an analysis using any method you wish. We'd like you to look at alternative solutions, because sometimes writing the software is not the best solution. Sometimes buying it might be. Look at the costs and the benefits. What is it you're really trying to do? And when you look at costs and benefits, a lot of the analyses I do are very large, and I wind up looking at intangible benefits, and sometimes they're more interesting than the costs. Why is it we're doing this? What's the benefit to the customer and the customer's users that really matters? Take the time to look at that, because I've seen more than one project get sold far more on intangible benefits sometimes than the cost stuff. And we tend to get hung up in cost. But look at why you're doing it, what benefits to the user base. Identify risks. You may have noticed we've had a little bit of push lately on security issues and other things. The days of trying to do a project now without a security code review are effectively gone. And that adds additional time to the process, and we understand that. But you don't want to be in the room when your stuff's been hacked and sensitive information has been disclosed. It's not a pleasant meeting. So I would recommend that you look at the risks, look what the issues are, and again, make sure you get budget approval. Real common sense. I don't know whether any of you, most of you probably wouldn't consider building a house which you might even pay for it. And we really are just building a house here. We just need to find the rooms and figure out what it is we're trying to put together. This one is one of my personal favorites because I think I've been in this meeting more times than I can remember. I need to know your requirements before I start to design the software. First of all, what are you trying to accomplish? You all been there? You get some interesting answers. I love this one. I'm trying to make you design my software. I've been in that meeting. I know I have, multiple times. I mean, what are you trying to accomplish with the software? Good questions, right? Perfectly reasonable. I won't know what I can accomplish till you tell me what the software can do. Been there too. Those are weird meetings, aren't they? Then the next one is classic. Try to get this concept through your thick skull. The software can do whatever I design it to do. Well, maybe. Then finally, can you design it to tell you my requirements? I don't think I've run into that problem for, maybe within the last month. So this is an important phase, getting the requirements from the customer down, managing expectations, making sure we have an understanding of what's going on. Because if we don't, we're a world of hurt. Because I don't care how good you guys are at coding and developing, you're going to get in trouble. And it really hinges right here. We've all use different methods, the user story, the use case, all kinds of things to try to figure out what exactly the customer wants. They're all valid tools. We're not telling you not to use them or to use them, but make sure you get these issues out. Because one of the things, if you're auditing a project, one of the first things you're going to do is go back and say, well, what were the identified business requirements? So I would suggest that's an artifact you better write down. That one matters. So now, if you've got a set of business requirements, then what are the project goals and what are the functions you have to use? There's another really funny Dilbert cartoon that talks about this same topic, and Dilbert's sitting down there and looks at the customer and says, you know, you have 400 different functions you want to implement. That's impossible. No one will ever be able to use the software. And so the customer comes back and says, oh yeah, I forgot one, ease of use. You've all been there, I think, too, where sometimes people come in with these grandiose notions of what the software is going to do, but the reality is there's this gap. Okay? Analyze end user information needs. That seems so obvious, but what's the user going to do with all this stuff you're doing? Do you ever have one of these report requests for 100 different reports? You find out they really only use 3? Why not write 3 and not write the other 97? You know, there are a lot of issues here that matter. And this is a place where I think documentation is important, back to your earlier question, because you want to tie this stuff down. Otherwise, you're coding to something amorphous, and you'll never know when done is. I don't know about you, but I hate doing software projects when I can't tell when I'm through, or at least with the first phase. Now, my brain is now starting to phase everything and saying, okay, first phase is this level of functionality, and oh yeah, there's a phase 2, 3, 4, whatever it may be, where we're going to do other things. Be sure in this phase that you talk carefully with the customer about requirements for security, mobility, accessibility, platform use expectations. Some customers still think, oh, well, they'll just use it on their desktops and laptops. Tilt, 21% aren't, as of today. That means we've got to have a design, in all probability, that's going to be responsive. Oh, well, set up the screen so that it's really using all the space available so it works great with the mouse. Tilt, big problem again, people are using pointers. Wint is only one metaphor, and it's the old one. So more and more, we've got to need more white space. We've got to be thinking about how people interact with this application. We have some applications in the state that are notably deficient in this area. I'm not going to call them out, but I think if you think about it, you'll think of a few that are really hard to use on mobile devices. Phase 3, systems design. You've all seen this cartoon before, and I think some of us have built it. Everybody has a different perspective of what's going on. This is another really good time to make sure that the design of the program is actually aligning with the expectations of the business. And you notice I keep going back to the business again, because it's very easy as a developer, and I've done this, I'm sure many of you have, where we think, oh, I got it. I'm going to start coding this little sucker. Well, maybe it's time to slow down and make sure you really got it. Because if you don't, you're going to build something the client didn't want. We had a large organization here in the city that put up a total revision to a very large website. I mean, very large. Hundreds of millions of records in their database. They called me and asked me to look at it. I said, well, gee, it's fine. Did you know it's not accessible? Oh, did you know it does work on mobile devices? Oh, really? Hadn't thought about it. They went back and fixed it. They didn't believe me in the accessibility issue because it had terrible contrast levels. And so I said, well, just project it. And so the guy that was in charge of it projected it on the screen. You could read the screen. There's clue number 1 that there's a problem. So we need to really look at this carefully enough so that as we start taking the technical design, the database design, all the pieces that we do, that we're actually going to build something that works and that the customer wants. And again, to me, this is kind of common sense, and maybe after 30 years of doing this, I've been kicked in the head enough times that I'm beginning to get it. Hopefully it won't take you that long, but it is an issue. And I've seen quite a few system rollouts where the customer looks and says, this is a great place to use prototyping, by the way. And on large projects, one of the things I was noticing was down at Fidelity, looking at their process with them. a couple of weeks ago. And when they're in this stage, they're doing vertical prototypes that cut across the entire system. So yes, they're looking at the UI. Yes, they're looking at the database and how it works. Yes, they're looking at the deployment and doing a full vertical slice to make sure all the pieces will play together. It isn't really that hard to do. And it's something we ought to seriously consider, because you remember how we encouraged you for years to make sure your dev environment, your test, and your production environment are pretty similar, because otherwise you're going to get burned. Fidelity has been working around this issue, having been burned, I might add, really badly, a time or two, and doing large vertical slices for prototypes. As a customer, prototypes are one of my favorite things, because then I can find out if you really got it, or if I'm going to get this, or maybe something with the tire swing through the middle of the tree. So use prototyping, it's your friend. Don't kill yourself with it, but it's a wonderful way to get customer concurrence. So systems design. Design features and operations details. Back to documentation again. This is another documentation point where you want to make sure you have that tied down within reason. Write it so human beings can understand it. Don't go geek on me, because your customers really don't like geek all that well, I find. I like prototyping, and I like to use it every chance I can. Because especially when you're working with customers that are not into coding, give them a prototype. I don't even care if it's pictures done in Visio or Omnigraph or whatever you want to use, but give them something so that they can see what this is going to look like. You really do need to start looking at screen layout. One of the things that I've noticed working on accounting systems and systems that are fairly complex from a data entry perspective is, do you know who your very best people to look at that stuff are? Not the manager, the guy paying for the project, but the man or woman that's doing the data entry. They're really useful, because you can watch how they behave, and all of a sudden you learn things that you never would have picked up before. One of the programs I reviewed in the last 3 or 4 months, again, a very large program, but obviously written by coders who didn't understand the subject matter of the program. If they did, they would have worked differently, because they've given you all kinds of access to stuff, but none of it fits together the way people work. So I like to watch just normal people to do the work, and I learn a lot from that. And this is a great place to tie that down, and again, prototyping helps. Is it obvious that if you've got a 4-week programming project, the level of detail required may not be as great as one that lasts for a 1.5 years or 2? You know what the biggest problem with 1.5 year, 2-year projects is? Sometimes we forget what we're building from start to finish, or it morphs so many times that our brains start to leave us. That they're very hard. I love short projects. So one of the things I like to do is I like to see things broken up into as many small pieces as possible, so that you can assess whether that deliverable really works.
Plus you get quick wins.
Pardon me?
I said, plus you get quick wins.
Quick wins. Quick wins are helpful. These projects that drag on forever are horrible. Plus, from a change management, change control perspective, even a testing environment, you can see the problems as you go. That matters. Big projects are really tough. Development, my personal favorite. None of you have ever been in this position before. You notice pointy-haired boss says, did I remember to tell you before you finished the coding that the user specifications changed? Anybody been there? We've all been there, haven't we? Notice Dilbert isn't handling it well. I suspect most of you have maybe been there a time or two where somebody knew about the change but didn't pass it on. So again, we're back to the business vision. The business has an idea of what they want this thing to do, whatever it may be. Our job is to make that a reality. So we're bridging the gap between vision and reality, and we've got to be practical and reasonable. And it's a bit of a challenge. So now we're developing code, again, preferably in functional components that can be tested separately, and as Norm said, give you some quick wins. This is the point at which you need to start looking at standards. You know the code you're writing and putting together is going to get a code review by security. That's going to happen. Not a good time to write sloppy code. You need to begin thinking, making sure that you're doing the right things. And you need to start applying state standards. One of the things we realize is not all the standards are created equally either. Surprise, surprise. There are some things that really matter and some things that are nice to know about, but you may never run into. So as we did checklists for this SDLC, we've taken like a 51-page web standards document and summarized it to a page and a quarter. So all you have to do is look at the page and a quarter initially so you can make sure, here's some issues I've got to address. Accessibility, 1 page. Here are the tests, here are things I need to address. So we're trying to do this in such a way so that we're not burdening you with more reading than you have time for. Because frankly, we understand you don't. But you need to look at accessibility, at privacy, security, mobility, usability, web standards.
I have a question on
Yes.
that. So we primarily design software that's used by state employees,
Mhm.
and it's designed to be used at a desktop machine. So it actually, I mean, the application runs just fine on like an iPad
Mhm.
or even a phone, although it's not sized down because we use GWT or GWT, so it'll
Right.
run pretty much on anything. But it doesn't really need to be mobile because it's not designed to be used that way. And same with accessibility, I guess, to a degree, because they're all employees that are using it. It's not going to be the general
Let me
public.
tell you a story about the employee accessibility, and I think it'll make my point. I agree with you on mobility. There are some applications clearly that aren't going anywhere. Sure, don't worry about it. But you still might want to use responsive design just in case something happens. I was over in the office of the director of the Office of Management and Budget, and she is blind, by the way, and a brilliant individual, and was trying to do something really complex like log in. Couldn't do it. You know why? Because login 2 wasn't accessible. The tables weren't set up properly. There were no labels assigned. And so when any of her readers saw that, she was at full stop. Be careful with this because you just don't know. I mean, the accessibility side, actually, we had an inquiry from the governor's office not long ago that basically said everything needs to be accessible. Not just web apps, but everything.
Ryan, I can see that for, depending on the situation,
Yeah.
but I think it would probably cost more, sometimes take more time to make something accessible if you didn't use to.
It might, but be careful to prescribe need, because you just never know who somebody's going to hire who may be using the software. I would rather see error on the side of accessibility, particularly since testing for it has gotten relatively easy and remediation is not that hard either. Now, either one of those were buggers, I'm with you. But I think we've got to the point now where accessibility really is pretty realistic. Now, if you asked me that same question 5 years ago, I might have given you a very different answer. Use the checklists for each of the areas that we talked about in this, because they're short. It's like having an abstraction of big, heavy, boring documents. Integration and testing, this is also an interesting one where we start assembling all the pieces and see if it works. All been there, right? Does it always work? Come on, you can tell me. It doesn't, does it? Sometimes things don't quite play the way you thought they would. Darn. Sometimes you find out that you put so flippin' many features into the software that it's painful. Okay, and the Stillbrook cartoon kind of illustrates that. I have all the product features that each of you demanded. Now our product is a worthless hodgepodge of complexity. I appreciate your input. I couldn't have failed without you. I think we've all been there in one form or another. Sometimes we take it to the point of pain and we just don't want to do that. So again, the big question here is, like, what are the things we need to look at? To your point on accessibility, yes, of course, you need to consider your audience. In a very tightly defined audience, you may not spend as much time. I would submit to you that you can do accessibility without hurting yourself, especially if you take it to a reasonable level. If you're trying to be perfect, good luck with that. Accessibility is a moving target. It changes based on environment. One thing I'd like to see you not do, and a common accessibility mistake that has nothing to do with physical limitations, is some of us program to comfort zones. Any of you have programmed just IE? Not a very good idea, really, as it turns out. So you need to make sure you're multi-browser. If you think in your mind some of the big applications we have that are really browser sensitive in the state, they shouldn't be. So those are things we really need to correct. And to me, that's an accessibility problem that really matters. We need to pay a lot of attention to. Again, we're looking for errors, bugs, interoperability. completeness, we want to make sure that things are working. So we've got accessibility, we've got environment, we've got the user interface. I don't suppose any of you ever always just define perfect user interfaces, do you? I certainly don't. I've screwed up more than I've done well, I think. But again, your users tell you a lot of good things about that if you listen to them. Load testing, privacy policy compliance. There are state laws that have to be followed on gathering information, and there's no wiggle room. You will do it right. If you don't, we're a world hurt. Security code testing, it will happen. When an application is released, it will go through a security review. Have any of you ever written what I lovingly call spaghetti code? Where you just intermix everything together. It's so cool because it's all in one big block of code, even the database. So somebody gets in there, what a wonderful day they're going to have. It's pillage and plunder time. So you want to make sure that you're structuring your code in such a way that it's not at risk. Stupidity is common and it affects us all from time to time. You want to make sure if you've got web standards, I've given you a checklist, page-long web standards. Do you comply? It won't take you long to figure it out. Now, if I give you the whole 50-page document, you could hate me, okay? I don't want you to do that. I want you to go through the checklist in each case where they're appropriate and see how things go. It doesn't take that long. Acceptance, installation, and deployment. This is where the business looks at it, signs off, and says, you know what? You actually did build what we wanted. This is amazing. Let's get it out there and get data on it where people can use it. And my only comment on this is it's only partially amazing because I've never, ever rolled out a software project that didn't have an implicit phase 2, 3, 4, 5, other things the business wants to do. They couldn't get done within initial budget or time constraints. I think we've all been there from time to time. This is the final real checkpoint on compliance. Is security good? Have we done everything we need to do? Is it accessible? How to do on the accessibility test? If we ran accessibility tests or using that, if that's an issue. Remember when you go to the public side, if you're writing apps that are public, these are kind of not optional. You absolutely have to do this. You pretty much have to be platform independent. You pretty much have to be accessible. And it's not really much of an option to ignore. Internally, yeah, we can do some things internally that are maybe a bit different in some of these areas. And if an application is never mobile, yeah, no big issue. But be careful with never, because you never know for sure what your customers will do, because the founders are unpredictable. Isn't that terrible? They even change their minds and methods. Totally unacceptable, but they do. And we have to be able to adapt to that. Remember, as you're looking at this when you're testing, I know it's expensive, but you really do need to look seriously, making sure that when you're going from dev to test to production, they're not apple and orange environments. Sometimes strange and wonderful things happen. You ever see anything unusual happen, Russ, when stuff is moved into prod and doesn't work?
Never.
Never. You ever notice that sometimes what you did in dev didn't work in test? I think we've all been there. So try to be careful with that. Maintenance. This one is an interesting one because maintenance really there's so many things that come up in maintenance mode. This is the area where now we're going through change control. We're making sure that we're not breaking things. We're making sure that things are working well together. None of us have ever done what your boss is doing. Phase 1 will tell our customer that the system failure won't happen again. I think I have done that. In phase 2, when it happens again, we'll act surprised. I've done that too. Now phase 3, I'm not going to admit to, because I certainly would do a thing like that. But the point is, sometimes we really frustrate our customers by not paying attention to change control, to routine maintenance procedures, and they matter. And I think, Russ, I'm safe in saying that they matter a lot to DTS, correct?
Yes.
So we need to pay a lot of attention to this. This is where the enhancements roll in, and quite frankly, when you start making enhancements, most of the time there are changes to the program, they need to go through change control, they need to be checked, so we don't get a bad bite. So, software's life cycle, this is also a good place to say, okay, how long is this sucker gonna be out there? Is this gonna be there for a year, for 6 months? Any of you ever do ad hoc software that's just gonna be there to solve a purpose and say, bye-bye later? We've all done that. And our behavior varies on those things in terms of how much effort and pain we put into keeping it up and running and being careful with it. Bear in mind that anything that hits a software package that we deploy that has a security impact, an accessibility impact, privacy impact, can have a huge impact on your project. So you don't want to have those kind of impacts here. You want to sweep them out earlier. If we don't, we're in trouble. Again, implementation enhancement requests from the customer, kind of a no-brainer. They will always come. Those are my perennial phase 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and whatever else is out there. And I like breaking those out because at least we've come to an agreement on what done looks like. And that's helpful to me. Checklists. Why would we do a thing like checklists? The reason is because we have a suspicion that you're not reading every standards document enough. It's just a rumor. Actually, I don't read them all either. After the first time, that's really boring. Some of them are hard to deal with, and I understand that. So we said to ourselves, if I'm developing, what do I really need to look at that really matters? Like for accessibility, what are the key accessibility issues that are going to cause you headaches and make you unhappy? So what we've done then is create a bunch of checklists. We're not through creating checklists. Whereas the SDLC is a formally approved policy, the checklists themselves, they're approved as well, but they have more flexibility. I want feedback from you on these checklists as you have a chance to look at them. If there are checklists you'd like to see that we haven't developed yet, please tell me. Got a request for one yesterday that was kind of interesting, and this is an accessibility one, which totally surprised me. And that is, would you please come up with a checklist for us, basically wasn't there, on how do you test accessibility on mobile platforms? Interesting question. Guess what? There are some good ways of doing it. But probably most of us in this room, it would pop right into your head how to do that. So we'll do a short checklist for you, appropriate references so you know how to do it. Less than a page. My guideline with all these checklists has been a page. I went out to go a page and a quarter of web standards because 51 pages to a page and a quarter was a lot of work. Okay? But most of them are a page or less. And we're doing that by design to keep them short. So the accessibility checklist, you have one page, you have references to the testing tools you need to use. It isn't hard. Privacy, same issues. We're reflecting the law back to you so you know what the legal issues are, and so you don't start collecting information on children and making mistakes. And we all laugh at that, so nobody would ever do that. No, they will. Actually, it's happened. When you look at some of the things, some of the types of information handled by the state, some of it's extremely sensitive. And we have to handle it appropriately or we're hurt. And the business should be aware of that, and probably will be, but we want to make sure you're aware of it too. Web standards, again, it's a page and a quarter of a 51-page presentation. The accessibility checklist takes a 10 or 12-page document and boils it down to less, I think it's just exactly 1 page. And if you look at those things, you will solve most of the common accessibility problems shown with state apps.
No, so these checklists, are they on your ARB?
Yes, they are. And I'll give you a reference to them in just a moment. The checklist document, 6 pages for everything that's there. This one, again, 2 pages. So not a lot of stuff you have to digest. The security checklist only has 4 items on it, but they're good ones. But I said, Tim, don't you want to lay more than that on these guys? And he said, no, I don't think so. Let's keep it short and to the point. If there are things we want you to think about that matter, let's keep it at that level. So that's what we've done. MDM. I think Judy has been fighting a battle waiting for us to get ready to do MDM deployment, correct? We're close. I got a report on it yesterday. But there's an MDM checklist in there as well, so you know what the steps are that you have to go through. There are checklists for iOS-based applications, Android-based applications in a mobile environment. So they're there. There's the general deployment checklist that is also available. And the checklists themselves, if you go to the ARB website, fairly straightforward, just comes up on the news page. And if you look approved or revised during the past year, the first item you'll see is the software development checklist or software development policy, and next is the SDLC checklist. Not hard to get. You can go to them, and there it is. You'll notice there are a lot of links linking you to more detailed documents. What we're really saying to you is, yes, you may wish to look at those, but it probably isn't essential for starters. The flow and the pieces of the SDLC matter a lot. They're all auditable steps. They're all potentially something someone comes and please show me how you got this information. What you have to do is tell me. And if you look at the checklists themselves, fairly simple. If you look at accessibility, you notice, curiously enough, I've arranged these in the order of greatest offense, the things that we tend to do wrong. And so if you start down the list, you'll find that for the most part, you can't imagine how many instances we have where there are no alternate text with images. And if you watch someone that's blind doing this, you soon find out, oops, that didn't work, because they have no idea what that image is. So, easy problem, tables. The whole problem with Kristen Cox and her use of login was strictly a table problem. There weren't any labels. You couldn't tell what you were looking at when your eyes are closed. And by the way, another thing that's really kind of fun to do sometimes is turn on accessibility. It works especially well on a Mac or an iPad, because they've done a pretty good job of building it in. You see how well you can navigate if you can't see the screen. I have had to do this for a couple of people as a test. Believe me, it's an interesting experience. It changes your whole point of view. Okay, privacy checklist, again, standard stuff. These are all available. I'd encourage you to look at them. On the checklist, please give me feedback. For example, if you think that you say, you know what, there's not a database provisioning checklist, tell me, we'll develop it. Because I recognize that one of the earlier questions I had when I was first doing some development in the state was, how do I provision a database? Did I just roll my own? I can do that. Should I? I don't know. As a matter of fact, not a good idea. So anything you think that we've missed, please let us know. Again, we're going to have another checklist for you in a few days on testing accessibility of mobile devices. We have guidelines on doing responsive design. Glad to help you with that. Can break that down to a fairly straightforward checklist if you want. The intent here is to make it short enough and understandable enough that you actually have a chance of doing something with it. And if it doesn't work, I hope you tell us. That really matters. Now, deployment is an issue. Judy's obviously struggling with one right now that's a deployment problem. Darius, would you like to take a moment just to address the deployment policy of the state? Do you want me to put it up on the screen?
I don't know if I want to or not, but so basically, as many of you were aware, last year they approved a deployment policy as came out from the audit that was done in the state. That one thing that we're not doing very well of. So they created a policy, and the person or group deploying it into production needs to be separate from the developer or the tester. And so DTS created a policy that the hosting group will be deploying all production deploys. And we are working on some processes now to come around and meet with the different campuses and agencies and groups to help facilitate some process in that. And so we can kind of look forward to that in the near future. We understand that it's not something that we can turn on overnight, but it's something that you need to all be working on developing now to separate those duties. We'd like to automate as much of it as we can. We have an automated process that we've created now for Java and .NET. We're kind of going to work through some of the others. The off-the-shelf, that'll be and then one-on-one basis how we'll work to deploy those. But those are things that, as developers, you'll need to start figuring out how you're going to separate that and start separating yourself from doing the deployments as we've generally done throughout the state in the past. Any questions?
Did you say just for production, or was that for test too?
The policy is just for production. The preference is if we involve a hosting group or a testing group in the testing phase, that it'll help alleviate some of the foreseen problems. But officially, the policy says production. As a hosting group, we'd like to be involved in testing because then the bugs can be worked out, so production's a lot smoother. The fear was that there wouldn't be enough resource to handle both out the gates, but we're willing to try to get involved in testing things.
Sometimes we'll deploy 2 hours. So we have a dev, test, AT, and a production environment. And like to our dev environment, sometimes we deploy like 6 or 7 times a day, and just to wait for a system administrator to deploy. And then we use Hudson, and so it's just we get some new code, and then we can just go there if we need to deploy, and we can.
Yeah.
And that works out pretty slick. We don't do that for production. All our productions are coordinated with sysadmins.
Cool, very good. And that's another point. I don't know how many are using repositories, but we're trying to implement as part of the separation of duty, trying to ensure everybody's implementing those steps as well. So if you're not using any kind of repository, that's something you need to start working on implementing at this point. All right, any other questions? Okay, thanks.
Now, do you have any questions? I've gone through doing a presentation on the SDLC. I hope you have an idea that we're trying to keep this as simple and straightforward as we can. We're trying not to be prescriptive and tell you how to do your job. I think you already know, most of you anyway. What questions do you have? Please, Judy.
When the SDLC first came out, we filled out a bunch of paperwork. Whatever happened with that? I mean, is it just a dead issue and we have to start over? Or?
What kind of paperwork?
It was an SDLC checklist. There were 2 separate ones. I don't remember the numbers on my one.
It's all been replaced. Okay. That doesn't mean the stuff you did in the past is no good. It just means you don't need to do it again in the same way. One of the things we heard back from every developer in the state on this, and I think there were very few exceptions, is please take a common sense approach. Don't burden us with a lot of paperwork crap that we don't need. It's pretty evident what we've got to tie down and document. I mean, to not tie down requirements, probably not a real good, prudent business move. You just need to do that. You kind of all know that, because otherwise you'll never remember them all. But we're trying not to burden you with any more paperwork, so no, I know what you mean now. I remember that. No, it's not there anymore. Just replaces it. Okay? And we haven't, again, because of the differences of projects, we haven't tried to structure you to the point where you have to do a certain level of documentation. I think you can figure it out. I can't certainly come up with one pattern that will work for every type of project. There's just too much variability. Other questions? Yes?
How do you see this? Like, I mean, I can see this working for big projects, or what about for iterative releases? Like we deploy bug fixes and enhancements, and sometimes minor, like I wouldn't call it like an enhancement, it's a whole new feature or screens or whatever. But they're still just being applied to the exact same application. Like it's not a change, it fits inside the same framework, pretty much everything's the same. I mean, the security really, I don't see it changing. I mean, I don't think it's bad to keep doing security checks, but how does this fit in with kind of like a three-week release cycle? Is this something we need to go through?
You need, again, to use common sense on it. If you're dealing with minor changes, one of my personal favorite for static text changes that people make to an app page, give me a break. I don't want to see 7 steps laid out for that kind of stuff. However, sometimes people do peculiar little things like, oh, we're just making a little bitty change to the database that all of a sudden is a very big deal. And those kinds of things do require some documentation. Use common sense. I mean, for little iterative releases, no, I wouldn't go through this whole cycle. but I would certainly document the release and what you were trying to accomplish with it.
I think you could use the iterative process within this SDLC.
Yeah.
I mean, you go along and you're gonna roll out a new feature. There's no reason why you can't hit the security piece and the integration and testing, and then
Right.
jump back to your next iteration. And you don't have to implement all of this into
Not at
that iterative process, but only pieces.
Right.
And if it's already within your budget, there's no reason to go through stage one again. You've
Sure.
already been there and done that.
And actually, so all the stuff that we've seen, I mean, we've been doing that for the last 4 or 5 years. We just haven't been filling out any paperwork or doing checklists or anything like that. So it's not like we're gonna have to change our procedures at all for this. It's just, we're just gonna have to fill out some forms and do some things like that.
Yeah, I think that's right, but bear in mind, you notice I didn't hit you with 101 forms. There's a reason for that. I don't think you need them. I don't even think you do well with them. If they make sense, you have to have them fine for everyone. Knock yourself out. But I'm not gonna be so prescriptive as to tell you you have to do a certain form a certain way. We're trying to get to a result, and the process isn't the result. Sometimes people get really confused with that. I think I do not, because the process is what enables the result. But the customer still wants the result at the other end, and appropriate level of documentation. Norm?
I just would say the checklists are reminders of what, to make sure you haven't forgotten.
That's right. That's what they're there for. Question back?
Yeah, how does this new process of the checklist fit in change control and enterprise change control?
I think it fits with the hand in glove. I mean, we refer to the change control policy. We don't expect you to do anything differently than you're doing now with change control. That was a big issue, as a matter of fact.
So the checklists are for ourselves, but we don't like submit them in with that? How's that
No,
work?
you don't need to submit them. You haven't done so in the past. I don't think Russ is looking to read all your checklists. That's the
I
last
get
thing.
enough documentation.
Yeah, but we want you to still integrate with the change control process. You notice we didn't write anything here that impacted change control adversely for a very specific reason. It's already working, okay? We already have provisions for emergency change. We have how often do you see emergency changes?
I've got 6 while we've been sitting in this.
See? It's alive and well. I kind of thought that might be the case. But those things are already there. The documentation that you create is stuff that you intuitively know needs to be there.
But I think if we were following some of the steps above number 6, we might have less emergency deploys if we
I think you're right.
did a little more planning.
Yep, I think you're absolutely right. Any other questions? Thank you very much for your time. Don't hesitate to get back to me, and if you see one additional checklist, tell me, we'll get the appropriate people together and build it for you. Anything that helps. That's the objective.